most important countries in the world, China and India, or India and China, depending on which way you like to order. Can everyone hear me? Oh, there we go. That's much better. All right. We're here to talk about two of the most important countries in the world, China and India, or India and China, whichever way you want to order it. I like India first, but that's just to be different. So, what we're going to do, we have a fabulous panel. Many of you would know them by reputation. Others would know them by having read the lengthy biographies in the program. So I'll introduce them briefly. Each person will speak about 5 minutes. Then we're going to have a discussion amongst the panel, and then we'll have about half an hour for audience questions. So please have your questions ready. We have a microphone that will come to you. If you just raise your hand, I'll grab you and direct the question to the appropriate panelists. Let me tell you who we have. First, we have Yao Yang. He's professor at China Center for Economic Research and the National School of Development at Peking University, and currently serves as director of CCR, deputy dean of NSD, in charge of academic affairs. And I suppose I know him better as editor of the center's house journal, China Economic Quarterly, which, as you know, is a very, very well-respected journal on China. Next to him is Nicholas Stern, member of the Fung Global Institute's academic board, and also the I.G. Patel Professor of Economics and Government at LSE, and chairman of London School of Economics Asia Research Center. You have a lot of titles. Director of the India Observatory and chairman of the Grantham Institute, Research Institute on Climate Change. So next to him is Edwin Lim, co-director of China Economic Research and Advisory Program, where he works with Michael Spence, the Nobel laureate. Prior to this, he worked at the World Bank since 1970, and he was, importantly, the World Bank's lead economist on China from 1980 to 1990. He also led the founding of China's first international investment bank, CICC, China International Capital Corp, and served as its first CEO. Next, we have the most difficult name to pronounce in the entire program, Louis Kaus. Louis Kaus is project director of the Fung Global Institute. He coordinates its research into China and India. So he's the man to see. He has 18 years experience in macroeconomic analysis and policy work across different regions. And lastly, but not leastly, Pranay Gupta, who is Chief Investment Officer of Lombard Odier. He joined in 2012 as CIO Asia and Global Head of Investment Solutions for the private client and investment management business. And prior to this, he was Chief Investment Officer for ING Investment Management in Asia Pac and Deputy CIO for ING Investment Management Europe. So basically the entire world. I'm going to start, if I may, with Yao and ask for your thoughts on China and India. And I guess we need to.
Good morning. It's such a pleasure to be on this panel with our distinguished speakers. Let me just briefly say just my own thoughts, just one of my own thoughts on India and China. I prefer actually India and China the order. First I want to say actually India and China are not that different. If you look at every indicator, India started economic reform 12 years behind China. So if you look at every indicator, it seems that India's economic growth indicators are about 12 or 15 years behind China, everything. So I really don't think those two countries differ that much. But there is, however, there is one distinctive difference between those two countries. China is very much manufacturing-driven economy. India is more consumption-based. But I think that this has a lot to do with the histories of those two countries. If you look at the starting condition of those two countries in 1978 for China and in 1992 for India, you're going to find very different approaches to human capital accumulation and industrial capacity building. In India, for example, the education system was geared toward producing university graduates. It's much more elitist than China's. For example, in 1978, in India, 4.9% of young people were university graduates, whereas in China, the number was only 0.7%. But on the other hand, China's literacy rate at that time was 65% versus 40% in India. So that's quite a difference. And also, if you look at the life expectancy, it was also a big difference. Another difference is industrial capacity. Even in 1978, manufacturing accounts for 40% of China's GDP, whereas in India, it's only 17%. So I think the leadership conditions set apart those two countries in a quite dramatic way. But that also says a lot for the challenge for those two countries. Yesterday we were talking about the change course of the growth model in those two countries. In China, we have to do much more to change the growth model from a more investment-driven to a more consumption-driven economy. Consumption as a share of GDP has been declining so fast that has been beyond most of people's imagination. Saving rate, national saving rate has reached a record high of 52%, and the household consumption as a share of GDP has declined to less than 35%. That I don't think that's sustainable, and that's good for raising the welfare of ordinary people. So China has to do more to correct the growth model. On the Indian side, I would emphasize the opposite. That is, a manufacturing sector is critical for a large country like India. For a small country, of course, you can say I could just work on service. But for a large country, it's almost impossible. I think most of my India economist friends agree with me on that. But precisely because there is a lack of basic education to ordinary Indian people, especially young people, manufacturing is not very easy to develop in India. Of course, there are other problems like very strict labor standards or and regulations on entry. And another challenge, I think, to India is to make the growth more inclusive. Urbanization rate is quite low in India. That also gives an indicator of this long inclusiveness of the growth process. Whereas in China, because they have a huge growth of the manufacturing sector, we have absorbed so many rural people into urban area. So both countries face great challenges in the next 10 years in kind of almost two opposites. I think that both countries should move toward the middle of the spectrum. So, okay.
Thank you, yeah, that was really interesting. And then we're going to come back and talk about both the parallels and the opposite natures of India and China later on. But let me ask Nicholas Stern for his views, please.
Thank you very much. I also wanted to start historically, but I'll go back just a bit further than my colleague Yao Yang. And I should say that I've been working for 40 years in India, particularly in village India, but also on public finance. I've been following one village in Moradabad district of UP for 40 years, and data go back 60 years. So I tend to see India from the micro bottom up. But I've also worked quite a lot on public finance and other issues. In China for 25 years, since '88, when I was teaching in Renmin Dashway, People's University. I also wanted to relate what we're discussing today to the questions which Mike Spence and Andrew Sheng and Victor Fung were raising during this morning and yesterday. What are we doing that, as a 21st century think tank here, that would look different were we to examine these kinds of issues, say 40 years ago? And since I've been doing economics for a long time, I know what we were doing 40 years ago because I was doing it. And if you ask yourself on this question of growth, how we might have looked at it, how we were looking at it as economists at that time, I think what we would have done is we'd have worked in terms of aggregative growth models. We'd have asked about investment, technical progress in the long run. And if we were looking at data, we'd have looked, and we did as economists occasionally look at data, we would have done cross-country analysis with looking at lots of countries together. What's different with the way we're looking at this question now? We're taking the two most important cases and we're looking in depth at how change takes place, how it has taken place, how it will take place in those two places where we're trying to explain technical progress, not see it as something that comes from outside, and we have no illusions whatsoever about there being a steady state in the stories that we're examining. So in terms of method, an approach, perspective, I think we're looking at it in a very different way by deciding to look at growth through these two case studies. I think that's important. If we go back just a bit further, I absolutely share what Yao Yang had to say about starting in the 70s and 80s. But it's important, I think, also to go back to liberation in China and independence in India. In the early years, both countries had a very strong focus on land reform, zamindari abolition in India, land to the tillers in China. In both countries, there was a deep suspicion of markets and of outsiders. The growth model that they had, for those of you who like your growth models, it was the Feldman-Mahalanobis model. Feldman, sort of a theoretician of the early transformation in the Soviet Union, Mahalanobis, the leader of economic transformation in India. It was a model of machines to make machines, fixed coefficients, machines to make machines. If you want to grow rapidly, first invest in your machines to make machines, and largely a closed economy model. In India in particular, it was supplemented by something sort of very different, which was the Swadeshi picture of a focus on made in India, made by hand in India. So you had those models and philosophies, which I think were of great importance, and of course both countries are very focused on centre-state issues, although they play out in different ways. In India, you have very strict allocation of, for example, taxation powers, strict allocation of subject matter, so that electricity is a state subject matter, land issues largely a state subject matter in India. That deriving from the Government of India Act 1935, for which as a Brit I ought to apologise deeply because it's a gratuitous constraint on policy in India that has passed through to the present day. There's lots more to say, of course, but I think that history and structure is very important in understanding what happens next. I'll leap through the 80s and 90s because Yao Yang covered those, and then just look forward from here. I should, though, just add one thing to the history. It's obvious, but it's terribly important, is that both countries have suffered big traumas. India suffered the traumas of the 60s with war with its neighbours, including with China. It suffered deep droughts, which disrupted the planning process. The traumas in China, of course, even more, much more traumatic than in India, with the famines around 1960 and the Cultural Revolution. I think the result was that China started with a lower base because its traumas were much more destructive than were India's. I think if you fast forward then to where we are now, it's actually India that has the low base. So China, as it were, grew rapidly from a lower base in many ways than India, but now I think you're going to see India, I don't know if it's an advantage to have a lower base, but in terms of growth rates, India might have that, quotes, advantage at the lower base. I mean, not simply in terms of income, because that's obvious, but I think if you look at the investment climate in China, how long it takes you to get your goods through the ports, how often you're visited by the local authorities for some bureaucratic transaction, which usually leaves the person departing a bit better off than when they arrive, how often the electricity goes off. I mean, those basic things of doing business, I think, are clearly much worse in India than they are in China. So the investment climate is worse. Of course, the investment climate is getting better in India. If you look at the tax systems, and I think this is very important to remember the way public finance works in the different countries. The public finance base is stronger in China, and that allows for much more flexibility in responding to crises. Because China has a stronger public finance system, it's able to follow Keynesian policies in response to fluctuations in a much easier way, and it has done too. If you look at the crises in crises in the world and recessions over the last 15 years or so. One of the reasons is, and Ed will remember this, we were together in Dalian, you remember, in the early 1990s, at which the great public finance changes were discussed in China. And when you move from a state to a market economy, you have to, when you've got a state-run economy, you just take whatever you want and leave the rest for the consumers if you're running the country. If you move to a market economy where incomes are generated outside the state system, you have to tax it back if you want to make your investments in infrastructure, education, and so on. So I think the public finance system is healthier in China than it is in India, and I think the reform of the Indian public finances, which has begun, needs to move much faster. You know, roughly half of the central government's funds in India go on subsidies. It's absolutely outrageous. Subsidies on hydrocarbons and fertilizers in particular. It's a terrible waste.
Certainly not the case in China, is it? Yeah.
Well, there are lots of subsidies in China operate in different ways through state-owned enterprises.
That's right.
And so on. But the Indian system, I think, is particularly hampered by so much of public resources going on subsidies which largely benefit middle classes.
I think we'd better stop there.
Okay.
I want to go on and get Mr. Lim's thoughts, and if we could come back to you a bit later on the other.
Absolutely, and just to remind of what Isha Alawali was saying yesterday about skills and labour force and so on, which I thought was rather important.
I agree. Mr. Lim.
Hi. Robyn mentioned my China background, but she neglected to mention actually that I was for many years the World Bank Director responsible for India. And until I left India 10 years ago, I lived for quite a long time in India. Now, I never lived and worked in India long enough to really know about India, but I lived there long enough to have a big question in my mind about India. And that's, after 50 years of democracy, how can India has done so badly in terms of human development? If you look at the literacy rate, nutrition, child health, and almost all indicators. And now 50 years, that's 10 years ago. And it's now 60 years. And you know, so since I left India, I read about the aspirational growth and how much things are now better. And I read about India possibly catching up with China. So, in fact, with Louis, in fact, I lived long enough in India that I even visited villages in UP. So that not many people come back to your village. So I was really rather looking forward to evidence that India has finally turned around and is now obviously growing fast. And perhaps we can see a new situation in India, where two of the most eminent economists in India, John Durst and, of course, Amartya Sen, the most eminent Indian economist, Nobel Prize winner, did a study about a year ago, and in fact, Louis gave it to me, about the consequence of growth, putting growth in its place in India. And I'd just like to quote the conclusion from the study. There is probably no other examples in the history of world development of an economy growing so fast for so long with such limited result in terms of broad-based social progress. Now, this is not New York Times, Financial Times writing about India. This is India, most eminent economists writing about India. And it's not off the cuff. They did a very careful study of the development in India over the 20 years from 1990, the beginning of reform as we define it in India, to a couple of years ago. And that's the conclusion. And in fact, it's backed up with statistics. There's also another comparison which I found quite remarkable. They did a comparison of India and Bangladesh. I mean, never mind India and China, but India and Bangladesh over the last 20 years, from 1990 to 2010. And of course, India grew much faster than Bangladesh. And by 2010, India's per capita income is double that of Bangladesh. But by every single social indicator, Bangladesh was ahead of India. Now, what I want to say is we really have to, maybe this includes Bloomberg, we really have to get off this preoccupation with growth rate. You know, I mean, it's very good. I mean, Nick and I know, Amartya used to be very skeptical about growth. And he's finally got to the view that he accepts that growth is a necessary condition for poverty reduction and for human development. But it's not sufficient. It's absolutely not sufficient. And you know, and the other thing is, this is a democratic system. You know, I mean, the West talks about, use the term, the most populous democracy in the world. Now, after 60 years of democracy, how can there be so little human progress? And even after the acceleration of growth over the last decade. Now, we hear this morning, and I think it's very important, that both countries are embarking on their 12th five-year plan, because independence, liberation is about roughly the same time. India is 1 year behind. And both are seeking a new pattern of development. What I like to point out is that the pattern of development that we see in India and China in the past is not deliberate. It's the result of institution in those countries. India can't develop industry because it doesn't have the reliable power supply. And Nick mentioned ports. We did a study on ports. It's almost impossible to get anything out of the ports. So how India ever going to have a manufacturing export? And obviously, Indians are extremely smart, and that's why you have the IT industry and the export of IT services. You bypass all of that problem. The infrastructure, the road, the power, and the ports. Now, we talk about the change of development strategy in China. Now, first of all, you have to remember, China is trying to get its growth rate down. I remember a year ago, when Wen Jiabao said our target is 7.5%, there was really a concern that, oh, the growth rate in China is coming down, what the implication this will be for the world economy. But that was a target. And in fact, most Chinese believe my Chinese can't believe they can't reach their target. They can't reach their target because growth is going to be higher than that. China has to bring its growth rate down because the growth pattern in China is leading to pollutions, leading to wasteful use of natural resources, and it's leading to a very unbalanced growth pattern. And it has to bring its growth rate down. And Wen Jiabao was trying to bring it down to 7.5, and in fact he failed because it was what, 8.2 or something? Now, so the point I'm trying to make is that both countries need fundamental reform. It's good that India has finally begun to move. They first moved off the Hindu rate of growth, and now they're now approaching double digit. And it's extremely encouraging. But they also need to look at institutional reform. And I would say the difference between China and India is that both countries need very deep-seated reform, institutional, systemic, political reform. The big difference is that China talks about it all the time. It's the preoccupation. And even today, China the Wen Jiabao talk about the need for political reform. I've not seen any recognition in India that India needs fundamental institutional and political reform. Because obviously, even with the faster rate of growth in the last 10 years, the people of India are not being served by development. Thanks.
No, it's very interesting. I know Louis is going to talk a little bit, I think, about the current slowdown in Indian rate of growth. And I think the business community is quite concerned about whether it's reverting to the Hindu rate of growth. One hopes not. Louis.
Okay. Thank you, Robyn. I'm very pleased to be among such insightful, wise people. Thinking about, when we talk about growth models, I think it's important to remember what, again, is so specific about the growth models of the different countries. And I think there are many aspects of China's growth model, but one that stands out to me is this very strong role of the government, not just in terms of ownership and in having SOEs lead the industrialization, but also strong role of the government in actually directing resources to specific industrial sectors, to industry. You see the government everywhere. And so China has explicitly pursued an investment and industry-heavy growth model, and that has had a lot of tremendously laudable, positive outcomes. That's why China has been able to grow 3 decades at 10%. But it also is starting to lead to the imbalances that Edwin he already mentioned: economic, social, environmental, and external imbalances. But secondly, I would say that this growth model is now showing some issues in the sense that it has created a complex of government, SOE, business relationships, and we don't see a clear delineation between the state, where the state stops and the market begins. And China's main challenge lies in that area, in how to overcome that. India did not pursue so explicitly an investment and industry-heavy growth model as China did. Its macro policies and business climate, as Nick already said, it has also been less convincing. And so when we look for the reasons why India's share of industry over GDP is not as high, it's hard to say what part of that is caused by not having this explicit strategy and what part is caused by these more general issues in terms of infrastructure and the quality of governance. I completely agree with Edwin's point about when we ask in India, why do the teachers not show up, or why do the doctors not show up? Clearly, India has tremendous issues with the quality of governance. At the same time, probably, and I'll get to this a little bit later as well, the fundamental governance institutions in India are probably more compatible with a high-income country than those of China. And so they are both having issues in the institutional governance side, but the issues are different. And then moving more clearly to the policy-making process, and as we all said, both countries are trying to express a vision of how they want to change the way that their economies are growing in the coming decade. I think one of the issues in China is that China has been very successful in having coherent, consistent economic planning